The dust of Redemption Gulch was a fine red powder that coated everything, a second skin for a town that had none of its own. It settled in the lines of a man's face, in the folds of a woman's dress, and in the lungs of anyone who stayed too long. Tyne knew its taste, its grit between his teeth. He had been tasting it for 5 years, ever since he had climbed into this high, lonely territory, to bury a life he no longer wanted, and could no longer have. He was in town for salt, coffee, and shells, a trip he made only when the emptiness of his larder became more pressing than the emptiness of the world below his mountain. He stood outside Henderson's Mercantile, the splintered boardwalk groaning under his weight, and watched the small drama unfold across the street. It was the usual kind of ugliness the Gulch specialized in, brewed from greed and desperation. A man named Silas Blackwood, who owned the mine, the saloon, and most of the men in town, stood with his hands on his hips. His suit was black wool, impossibly clean in the swirling dust, a testament to his power. Before him stood a girl. She was Chinese, small and still, dressed in a silk tunic the color of a faded plum. The garment was beautiful but utterly wrong for this place, as fragile and out of place as a spring blossom on a slag heap. Blackwood was speaking, his voice carrying on the dry wind, a sound of polished stones grinding together. He was addressing the station master, a harried man with sweat stains blooming on his shirt. The girl, Blackwood explained with theatrical patience, was part of a contract, a bride meant for one of his foremen. But the foreman, a brute named Calloway, had taken one look at her and refused, said she was too small, too breakable, a doll, not a wife for a hard country. Now Blackwood was washing his hands of the matter. The contract was void. The passage was paid one way. She was, he declared with a flick of his wrist, no longer his concern. The crowd that had gathered was a loose, silent crescent of dusty hats and weary faces. They watched with the dull curiosity of people long accustomed to the casual cruelties of their world. There was no pity in their eyes, only a flat, assessing gaze. She was a problem, and they were waiting to see how it would be solved. The station master, flustered and anxious to please a man like Blackwood, gestured for the girl to leave. He pointed down the dusty track that led out of town and into the unforgiving expanse of rock and sagebrush. His meaning was clear. Go, vanish. The girl, whose name no one had bothered to ask, did not move. Her face was a pale, composed oval, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the jeering faces, beyond the ugly town, beyond the jagged peaks that tore at the sky. She stood with a stillness that was not born of fear, but of an immense bone-deep weariness. Her hands were clasped before her, the only sign of tension in the tight white of her knuckles. She had nothing. No money, no language they could understand, no place in this world that had summoned her, only to cast her out. Tyne watched from the shade of the Mercantile's awning. He had seen men die violent deaths. He had seen homes burn and hopes curdle into bitter dust. But there was a particular kind of coldness to this scene that found a crack in the wall he had built around himself. It was the sheer, unadorned indifference of it. The girl was not a person to them. She was a piece of cargo, misdelivered, and now discarded. Blackwood turned, satisfied, and strode toward the saloon, his polished boots leaving crisp prints in the red dust. The crowd began to disperse, the show over. Only the station master remained, growing more agitated by the girl's silent refusal to disappear. He took a step toward her, his hand raised. "Go on now, git!" Tyne felt a familiar, unwelcome tightening in his gut. It was the feeling that had preceded every mistake, every act of violence in his former life. He had come here to be done with that feeling, to starve it out in the silence of the high peaks. For 5 years he had succeeded. He had kept to himself, a ghost on the mountain, his only companions the wind and the memories he could not outrun. He had no stake in the affairs of Redemption Gulch. This was not his fight. He shifted his weight, turning to go into the store. Let the world handle its own ugliness. It was not his concern. He took one step, then another. The image of her still face, the white of her knuckles, followed him. He remembered another face, pale and still, another set of small hands. The memory was a physical blow, a ghost's fist to his chest. He stopped, his hand on the doorframe of the mercantile. He cursed, a low, bitter sound swallowed by the wind. He turned back. The station master had taken the girl by the arm now, trying to pull her along. She resisted, not with strength, but with that same profound stillness, becoming an anchor of silent refusal. Tyne crossed the street. His boots made no sound in the thick dust. He was a big man, and his shadow fell over the pair of them long before he arrived. The station master looked up, startled, and his hand dropped from the girl's arm. Tyne's face was not threatening. It was simply empty, a landscape scoured by a harsh wind, his blue eyes holding a cold, distant light. He did not look at the station master. He looked at the girl. She met his gaze. Her eyes were dark, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something in their depths. Not fear. It was a clear, intelligent appraisal. She was seeing him, all of him. The worn leather of his coat, the frayed collar of his shirt, the solitude etched into the lines around his eyes. Tyne was not a man of many words. The silence of the mountain had long since leached the habit of speech from him. He gestured toward his wagon, parked at the edge of town. "I need a cook," he said. The words were rough, unused things in his throat. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a solution to a problem. His problem was a cold hearth and meals of dry tack. Her problem was everything. It was a transaction, nothing more, a way to quiet the ghost that had risen in his chest. The station master gaped at him. "Tyne? What business is it of yours?" Tyne ignored him. He kept his eyes on the girl. He had no idea if she understood his words, but she understood his gesture. She understood the offer for what it was, a plank thrown across a chasm. She looked at his face, her gaze searching, patient. She was looking for the shape of the man behind the offer, for the hook that was surely hidden in the bait. Tyne held her gaze and let her look. He had nothing to hide, because he had nothing left to show. There was only the emptiness and a stubborn refusal to see this one small injustice play out to its ugly end. After a long moment she gave a single shallow nod. It was a gesture of immense dignity, an acceptance not of charity but of terms. Tyne turned and walked toward his wagon. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she would be. He could hear the soft scuff of her thin slippers in the dust behind him. A sound as light and strange as a bird's wing beat in the oppressive silence of the gulch. The town watched them go, their whispers rising like the dust stirred by their passage. The hermit of the mountain had come down and claimed the discarded doll. It was a strange and unsettling thing, and they would talk of it for weeks. Tyne did not care. He was already thinking of the long, cold climb back to his solitude, a solitude that was now, inexplicably, shared. The journey to his homestead was a silent, punishing ascent. The wagon wheels churned through deepening ruts that snaked up the mountain, leaving the squalor of Redemption Gulch far below. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with pine and the sharp, cold smell of high-country rock. Tyne handled the mules with an economy of motion, his hands sure on the reins, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The girl, May, sat beside him on the hard wooden bench. He had learned her name when he'd stopped at Henderson's to settle her passage debt with Blackwood, a cost Henderson had sourly calculated. Tyne paid it in coin without a word, closing the ledger on her past. May sat as still as she had in the street, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She did not flinch at the lurching of the wagon or the sudden steep drops that fell away from the edge of the trail. Her gaze swept across the vast, brutal landscape, taking in the gnarled shapes of the bristle-cone pines, the sheer granite cliffs and the endless, aching blue of the sky. Tyne wondered what she saw. Did she see beauty, or only a larger, more savage prison than the one she had just escaped? He could not read her expression. It remained a mask of serene composure, a calm surface on a deep and unknown body of water. They arrived as the sun began to bleed its last colours across the western peaks. The cabin was nestled in a small sheltered meadow, backed by a dense stand of aspen and pine. It was not a home, it was a fortress against the world. Built of thick hand-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, it was low-roofed and solid, designed to withstand the crushing weight of winter snows. A plume of cold smoke trickled from the stone chimney, the last remnants of his morning fire. Beside it stood a small barn, equally sturdy, and a split-rail corral holding a single sturdy horse. It was a place of profound and deliberate isolation. Tyne brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. "We're here," he said, the words feeling loud in the immense quiet. May slid down from the bench, her movements fluid and graceful despite her fatigue. She stood for a moment, looking at the cabin. It was a man's place, stark and functional. There were no curtains in the two small windows, no flowers planted by the door, no touch of softness anywhere. There was only wood and stone and the encroaching wilderness. Tyne unhitched the mules, his movements practiced and efficient. He expected her to wait, to be told what to do. Instead, she walked to the back of the wagon and began to carefully unload the sacks of flour and salt he had bought. Her strength was surprising. She handled the smaller sacks with a steady competence that belied her delicate appearance. He led the mules to the barn, and when he returned, she had already carried most of the provisions to the cabin's porch. She had also collected a small bundle of kindling from the woodpile. She did not wait for his permission. She saw what needed to be done and did it. Inside, the cabin was one large room, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that took up most of the back wall. A rough-planked table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A narrow bed was built into one corner, a pile of furs and wool blankets serving as its mattress. Along the opposite wall were shelves holding a few tin plates, a cast-iron pot, a skillet, and little else. The air was cold and smelled of old wood smoke, leather, and loneliness. It was the physical manifestation of his own soul. May paused at the threshold, her eyes taking in the Spartan interior. Tyne gestured to a small, curtained-off alcove at the far end of the room. It was barely large enough for a cot he had never bothered to build. "That will be your space," he said. She gave another of her slight formal nods. Then, without a word, she went to the fireplace. She knelt on the stone hearth, her plum-coloured silk pooling around her, and began to lay a fire with the kindling she had gathered. Her hands moved with a deft, practiced certainty. Tyne watched her, a strange feeling stirring within him. For 5 years he had been the only source of warmth in this cabin. He had laid every fire, cooked every meal, endured every silence alone. Now a quiet, determined presence was kneeling at the heart of his solitude, coaxing a flame back to life. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by work and the changing mountain light. It was a silent rhythm, a conversation held through actions rather than words. Tyne would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to disturb her. He would find the fire already rekindled, a pot of coffee warming on the hearth, its rich aroma, a startlingly welcome change from the stale air that usually greeted him. He would go out to tend to his horse, chop wood, or check his trap lines, and when he returned, the cabin would be transformed. May was a force of quiet, relentless order. She scrubbed the soot from the stones of the fireplace. She washed the grime from the window panes, letting in a pale, clean light the room had not seen in years. She swept the floor until the planks shone with a faint luster. She took his worn, torn shirts and mended them with tiny, impossibly neat stitches. She took the flour, salted pork, and dried beans from his stores, and through some quiet alchemy turned them into meals that were simple but deeply nourishing. He found a bolt of rough canvas and some wool in an old trunk, and left them on the table for her. The next day she had fashioned a thick curtain for her alcove, granting herself a privacy he had not thought to offer. She began stitching a new dress for herself, one suited to the realities of her new life, its colour, the practical grey of mountain stone. The plum-coloured silk tunic she washed carefully and folded away, a last remnant of a life that no longer existed. They rarely spoke. The language barrier was a high wall between them, but even if it had not been, Tyne knew he would have had little to say. His words had been buried with his wife and daughter, but he found other ways to communicate. He noticed her thin slippers were wearing through and left a pair of sturdy, fleece-lined boots by the hearth for her one morning. He saw her rubbing her hands against the cold and came back from his next trip to the woods with a pair of soft deer-hide gloves he had fashioned. She, in turn, communicated through her care. She saw the way he favoured his right shoulder, an old injury that ached in the cold, and began leaving a hot, herb-scented compress by his bed each night. She noticed the lines of weariness around his eyes and ensured a hot meal was always ready when he came in from the cold. They orbited each other in the small space of the cabin, two solitary planets slowly being drawn into a shared gravitational pull, their understanding growing in the vast, silent spaces between them. He learned the cadence of her quiet humming as she worked. She learned the sound of his footsteps, could tell by their weight whether the day's hunt had been successful. It was a life of a kind, a fragile truce with the emptiness he had chosen. The first snows came in late autumn, soft, fat flakes that drifted down from a sky the colour of lead. They blanketed the meadow, muffled the world in a thick layer of white, and sealed the cabin off from the world below. The silence deepened, becoming absolute. For Tyne, this was the time he usually sank deepest into himself, the cold and the quiet, a mirror for the winter in his own heart. But this year was different. The cabin was filled with the soft sounds of May's movements, the scent of baking bread, the steady, quiet presence of another human being. The silence was no longer empty, it was shared. One evening a blizzard descended from the high peaks, a screaming fury of wind and snow that shook the cabin to its foundations. Tyne had been caught out in it, checking a line of traps far up the slope. He had made it back, but the wind had been like a razor cutting through his thick coat, and the cold had sunk deep into his bones. By nightfall a fever had taken hold of him. He lay on his cot shivering uncontrollably, his body aching with a fire that the thick furs could not warm. The world dissolved into a haze of disjointed memories and feverish dreams. He was back in the war, the air thick with smoke and the screams of dying men. He was in a small farmhouse in a green valley, holding his wife, Sarah, her laughter like the sound of water over stones. He was holding his daughter Lily, a tiny warm bundle in his arms, her scent of milk and clean linen filling his senses. Through the fog of his delirium he was aware of a constant steady presence, a cool cloth on his forehead, a cup of hot bitter tea held to his lips, a small firm hand holding his own when the shivers became too violent. May was there, a tireless, silent sentinel in the heart of the storm raging both outside and within him. She did not sleep. She moved through the flickering firelight, her shadow a comforting shape against the log walls. In the deepest part of the night, when the fever was at its worst, he began to thrash, calling out names she could not understand. Sarah, Lily. The words were torn from him, fragments of a life he had locked away. The pain in his voice was a raw, naked thing. May knelt beside his cot. She could not understand his words, but she understood his grief. It was a language she knew intimately. She had seen it in her own father's eyes after her mother had been taken by sickness. She had felt it in her own heart when she had been forced to leave her home, a debt her family could not pay. She placed a hand on his chest, a small anchor in his storm-tossed sea of memory. And then she began to sing. Her voice was not loud or powerful. It was a soft, clear thread of sound, weaving its way through the howl of the wind. It was a lullaby from her homeland, a simple melody full of a deep and ancient sorrow, yet comforting, like the gentle rocking of a cradle. The words were strange, but the feeling they carried was universal. It was a song of loss, of endurance, of the quiet hope for a peaceful dawn after a long, dark night. The song cut through Ton's fevered haze. It was not Sarah's voice, but it held the same tenderness. It was not a song he had ever heard, but it spoke of the same love and loss he carried in his own heart. The violent images in his mind began to recede, replaced by the simple, pure notes of her song. The frantic pounding of his heart slowed. The tension in his limbs eased. He stopped fighting the memories and simply let them be, washed over by the gentle tide of her voice. He drifted, not into the darkness of delirium, but into a true healing sleep. As he lay there, his breathing finally evening out, May continued to sing, her voice a fragile shield against the storm. In the quiet intimacy of that blizzard-swept cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts, the wall between them finally dissolved. She was no longer just his cook, and he was no longer just her rescuer. They were two survivors huddled together for warmth in the long winter of their lives. When Tyne woke, the blizzard had passed. A weak, watery sunlight filtered through the snow-caked windows, filling the cabin with a soft blue-white light. The world outside was buried, silent and still. The fire crackled peacefully in the hearth. His fever was gone, leaving behind a profound weakness and a strange sense of clarity. May was asleep in one of the chairs by the fire, her head resting on her arms on the table. A wool blanket was draped over her shoulders. She looked small and exhausted. The composure of her face softened in sleep. He saw the faint dark circles under her eyes and knew she had not rested for days. He had been a burden, and she had borne it without complaint. He rose slowly, his limbs stiff, and pulled one of the heavy furs from his bed. He walked over to her and gently draped it over the thin blanket, tucking it around her. She stirred but did not wake. For a long moment he stood there just looking at her. He remembered the sound of her voice, the feel of her hand on his. She had pulled him back from a darkness he had not realized he was so close to entering. She had seen the raw, broken parts of him and had not turned away. Instead, she had sung to them. Later that day, as they shared a simple broth she had made, the silence between them was different. It was no longer a space of caution and observation, but one of comfort and understanding. "You were sick," she said, her English careful and halting. He was surprised. He had not known she possessed more than a few scattered words. She must have been practicing, listening. "I was," he confirmed, his own voice still rough. "You spoke of family," she added, her eyes on her bowl. "Sarah. Lily." She said the name softly, as if handling fragile glass. Tyne felt the old, familiar clenching in his chest. But for the first time it did not feel like it would shatter him. He looked at this small, resilient woman who had faced his ghosts with him. She deserved the truth. "My wife and my daughter," he said. The words hung in the quiet air. "They died of a fever 5 years ago, back east. There was nothing I could do." He did not say more. He did not need to. He did not speak of the rage and the grief that had hollowed him out, that had driven him to this mountain to escape a world that now seemed empty of meaning. May looked up, and her eyes were filled with a deep, knowing sorrow. "I am sorry," she said. Then she told him of her own loss, of her parents, farmers whose land had been ruined by a flood, of the crushing debt they had owed to a powerful man, of the contract that had been their only way to save their honor, sending their only daughter across an ocean to a man she had never met, a fate they had believed was better than starvation. She spoke of her journey, of the fear and the loneliness, and of the final casual cruelty in Redemption Gulch. She told her story in simple, direct sentences, without self-pity or accusation. It was simply the truth of her life. When she was finished, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. In sharing their stories, they had given each other the missing pieces of themselves. They were no longer just a man and a woman, but two histories of loss, two solitudes that had found a common shore. The snowbound cabin was no longer a prison or a refuge. It had become, for the first time, a home. The spring thaw came late that year, a slow, grudging retreat of the snow that revealed a world washed clean. The meadow turned a vibrant green, and the aspens shimmered with new leaves. Life returned to the mountain, and with it the world of men. Thine knew their peaceful isolation could not last. He was right. One afternoon, as he was splitting wood, he saw a rider coming up the trail. It was not a prospector or a lost hunter. The man rode a fine black horse, and he wore a clean dark suit. It was Silas Blackwood. Tarn rested his axe and watched him approach, his body tensing with a cold, controlled anger. May, who had been hanging laundry on a line stretched between two pines, saw him too. She froze, her hand still holding a white sheet, which billowed in the breeze like a flag of surrender. Tyne saw the fear in her eyes, the first he had ever seen there, and it ignited a protective instinct so fierce it startled him. Blackwood reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the scene with an air of ownership. He noted the neat stacks of firewood, the clean laundry, the small herb garden May had started near the door. His lips curled into a faint, unpleasant smile. "Well, Thane," he said, his voice smooth and condescending, "you've made yourself quite comfortable. It seems my discarded property has proven useful." Thane said nothing. He let the silence stretch, his grip tightening on the handle of his axe. Blackwood dismounted, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "I'll admit I was surprised. I never took you for the sort to get involved in other people's affairs, but the winter is long and a man gets lonely. I understand." He took a step closer, his eyes fixed on May. "The arrangement, however, is over. Calloway has had a change of heart. He's decided he wants her after all. I'm here to collect what is mine." He spoke of her as if she were a stray cow he had come to reclaim. May had retreated to the cabin doorway, but she stood tall, her fear hidden once more behind a mask of dignity. "She is not property," Thane said, his voice low and flat. "She is a free woman." Blackwood laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "A free woman? She is a debtor, brought here under contract, a contract that I hold. Her family's debt is substantial. Her passage was not cheap. Henderson tells me you paid some trifle to the station, a meaningless gesture. The real debt, the one that matters, is owed to me." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket. "It's all here, signed and sealed. According to the law, she belongs to me until her debt is paid in full. And I have decided it will be paid through her service to Calloway." He was using the law as a weapon, twisting it to serve his greed. Tarn knew that in the eyes of the corrupt system that ran Redemption Gulch, Blackwood's papers would be seen as legitimate. His own claim was based on nothing more than a sense of decency, a currency that held no value down in the gulch. "You can't have her," Tarn said. It was a simple statement, an immovable fact. Blackwood's smile vanished, replaced by a cold fury. "Don't be a fool, Thane. You're a squatter on this mountain, your claim tenuous at best. I have friends, influence. I can have you run off this land before the summer is out. I can make your life a living hell. Is this creature really worth all that?" He gestured dismissively toward May. "Give her to me now, and I will forget this ever happened. I'll even consider your land claim settled." It was an ultimatum, her or his home, her or his peace. But Tyne realized with a sudden, shocking clarity that the cabin, the mountain, the solitude, none of it meant anything without her. She was the one who had made it a home again. She had brought life back into the empty rooms of his world. To give her up would be to surrender his own soul for the second time. He looked past Blackwood at May standing in the doorway. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not a plea for rescue, but a quiet, unwavering strength. She would face whatever came with the same dignity she had shown from the very beginning, but she would not have to face it alone. Tyne took a step forward, planting his feet firmly in the soil of his land. He did not raise the axe, but held it loosely at his side. "Get off my land, Blackwood," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute finality, "and do not come back." For a moment the two men stood in silent opposition, the raw power of the mountain behind Tyne, the corrupt power of the town behind Blackwood. Blackwood's face was a mask of rage. He had not expected such defiance. He had expected the broken, solitary man to bend to his will. "You will regret this," Blackwood hissed. He climbed back onto his horse, his movements stiff with anger. "I will be back, and I will bring the law with me." He wheeled the horse around and galloped down the trail, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of his threat hanging in the clean mountain air. Tarn stood motionless until he was gone. The confrontation was not over. It had only just begun. He had declared war on the most powerful man in the territory, and the battle would be fought here, at the threshold of the home he was no longer willing to lose. A week passed in tense, watchful silence. Tyne worked, but his senses were always tuned to the trail below, listening for the sound of approaching horses. He cleaned his rifle, a relic from his past he had not touched in years, its weight familiar and cold in his hands. May continued her routines, but a new gravity shadowed her movements. They did not speak of Blackwood's threat. It was a storm cloud on the horizon, and words would not drive it away. They simply existed in the quiet space before the breaking of the storm, their unspoken solidarity a silent promise. Then, one bright, clear morning, they came. Thane saw them from the ridge above the cabin where he had been scouting. Blackwood was in the lead, flanked by Sheriff Brody, a man whose loyalty was bought and paid for, and two of Blackwood's hired thugs, men with hard faces and guns strapped to their thighs. Tyne moved quickly, circling back to the cabin through the trees. May was outside, weeding her small garden. She saw the look on his face and straightened up, her own expression becoming resolute. "Go inside," he said, his voice calm. "Stay away from the window." She hesitated, her eyes searching his. "Be careful," she whispered. He gave a short, sharp nod and watched her disappear into the cabin. He took his rifle from its pegs above the door and moved to the corner of the cabin, the solid logs providing good cover. He was a fool. He had brought this trouble to her. He should have just let her go, let her face her fate alone. But he knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that he could not have done it. His life of empty peace was a lie. This, protecting her, was the first real thing he had done in 5 years. The 4 riders emerged from the trees and came to a halt in the clearing. Sheriff Brody, looking uncomfortable, nudged his horse forward. "Thane," he called out, "come on out. We don't want any trouble." "You brought it with you, Brody," Thane called back, his voice steady. His rifle was not raised, but rested in the crook of his arm. Blackwood moved his horse alongside the sheriff's. "Enough of this foolishness," he sneered. "I have a legal writ from the circuit judge. This woman, May, is to be remanded to my custody as payment for a debt. You are obstructing justice. Surrender her now, or you will be arrested for it." "The only justice here is the one you buy, Blackwood," Thane said, "and she's not for sale." Blackwood's face darkened. He gave a nod to his 2 men. They dismounted slowly, their hands hovering near their pistols. The air grew thick with a deadly tension. This was it. The moment where it all ended in blood and smoke, just like it always had in his old life. He felt the familiar, cold calm settle over him, the narrowing of the world to the space between the hammer and the pin. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, the stock fitting into the familiar groove. He centered the sight on the chest of the first thug. He could end this, he could go back to the violence he knew so well. It would be easy. Just as his finger tightened on the trigger, the cabin door opened. May stepped out onto the porch. She was not holding a weapon. Her hands were empty at her sides. She wore the simple grey dress she had made, and her hair was neatly pinned. She looked at the armed men, at Blackwood's hateful face, at Tyne poised for battle. Her expression was not one of fear, but of an immense, heartbreaking sadness. And then she began to sing. It was the same song she had sung to him in the depths of his fever. The lullaby. The sound rose, pure and clear, into the tense silence of the meadow. It was not a song of defiance, it was a song of sorrow, of loss, of a profound and gentle spirit, facing a brutal world. The melody, filled with a quiet, aching beauty, seemed to hang in the air, a fragile thing against the backdrop of drawn guns and murderous intent. The thugs hesitated, their hard faces showing a flicker of confusion. Sheriff Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Even Blackwood seemed momentarily thrown off by the sheer unexpectedness of the act. But the song was not for them, it was for Thane. He heard it, and the world shifted. The cold calm of the killer shattered, and everything he had been holding back for 5 years came rushing in. He heard the echo of his wife Sarah's laughter. He saw the image of his daughter Lily, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. He felt the crushing weight of his grief, not as a distant ache, but as a fresh tearing wound. The song connected the past to the present, the love he had lost, to the love he was now terrified of losing. He was not just fighting for a woman he had rescued. He was fighting for the chance to have a home again, to hear singing in the quiet moments, to protect a life instead of just taking one. The violence he was about to unleash suddenly felt like a betrayal of everything her song represented. It was the old, empty way. The way of death and loneliness. She was offering another way. She was the way of life. His finger eased off the trigger. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the rifle. He did not take his eyes off Blackwood, but the killing rage was gone, replaced by a steely, unshakable resolve. He took a step out from behind the cover of the cabin, moving to stand slightly in front of May, shielding her with his body. He held the rifle loosely in one hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. Blackwood saw the change and mistook it for surrender. A triumphant smirk crossed his face. "Finally come to your senses, have you? Now step aside." Thane looked straight at Sheriff Brody, his voice ringing out in the clear mountain air, firm and absolute. "You will not take her," he said. "This woman is under my protection. She is my wife." The words stunned the clearing into silence. May's song faltered for a second, a single note catching in her throat as she looked at his back. The thugs stared, bewildered. Blackwood's jaw dropped. Sheriff Brody was the one who reacted. He was a weak man, a corrupt man. But he was not entirely without a soul. He understood the laws of the frontier, written and unwritten. A man's wife was his own business. To interfere was to cross a line from which there was often no return. A debt contract was one thing, breaking up a marriage was another. Blackwood's writ suddenly looked very flimsy. His wife? Brody asked, looking at Blackwood, a new uncertainty in his eyes. "He's lying," Blackwood sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "It's a trick." "Ask her," Thane said, his voice a low challenge. He did not turn to look at May. He did not need to. He trusted her. Sheriff Brody turned his gaze to May. Her singing had stopped. She stood there, her small frame filled with an incredible dignity. She looked from Thane's back to the sheriff. She took a small step forward to stand beside Thane, not behind him. She placed her hand gently on his arm. Then she looked directly at the sheriff and gave a single firm nod. That was all. But it was enough. The gesture was irrefutable. It was a claim, an acceptance, a confirmation. Sheriff Brody looked at the two of them standing together, the big, resolute mountain man and the small, unshakable woman. He looked at Blackwood's apoplectic face. He made his choice. "This is a domestic matter, Blackwood," he said, already turning his horse. "It's between a man and his wife. It ain't the law's business." He looked at Thane. "We're leaving. There'll be no more trouble from us." "There had better not be," Thane said quietly. Brody motioned for the two thugs who holstered their weapons and mounted their horses, looking relieved to be out of it. "You cowardly fool!" Blackwood shrieked at the sheriff's retreating back. "I own you!" But Brody did not look back. Blackwood was left alone, his power suddenly broken, his authority evaporated. He stared at Thane and May, his face a mask of pure, impotent hatred. He opened his mouth to say something else, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. He had been defeated, not by a gun, but by a song, and a simple declaration of truth. With a final, venomous glare, he wrenched his horse around and spurred it savagely down the trail, a man undone by a love he could not comprehend. Tyne and May stood together in the clearing, listening to the sound of the hoofbeats fade into the distance. The threat was gone. The meadow was quiet again, the only sounds the sigh of the wind in the pines and the frantic beating of their own hearts. The silence that followed was deep and profound. The adrenaline of the confrontation slowly seeped away, leaving behind a fragile, uncertain peace. May's hand was still on his arm, her touch a small point of warmth against his skin. He could feel the slight tremor in her fingers, the only sign of the terror she must have felt. He finally turned to look at her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear and steady. They held 1,000 questions. "My wife," he repeated. The words softer now, a statement of fact becoming a question. It was not a lie told to save her. In the moment he had said it, he had realized it was the deepest truth he knew. She did not answer with words. She simply looked up at him, her gaze searching his, just as she had done that first day in the dust of Redemption Gulch. She saw the truth in his eyes, the raw, unguarded emotion he no longer tried to hide. She saw the home he was offering, the future he was asking to share. A small, slow smile touched her lips for the first time. It was a thing of breathtaking beauty, a spring blossom after a long, hard winter. She tightened her grip on his arm, a silent answer that was more powerful than any vow. That evening they sat on the small porch he had built, watching the sun set behind the jagged peaks. The sky was awash in colors of rose and gold. The air was cool and clean, the world felt new, reborn. They did not need to speak of what had passed between them, of the declaration that had changed everything. It was understood. The arrangement of a cook and a master was gone, replaced by the partnership of a husband and a wife. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were small and strong, and they curled around his, fitting as if they were made to be there. They sat in comfortable silence, their shoulders just touching, watching the last light fade and the first stars appear in the deepening twilight. The cabin behind them was warm, a single lamp glowing in the window, a beacon of light in the vast wilderness. He had come to this mountain to be alone, to live out his days in an empty, silent penance. But a woman with a quiet song and an unbreakable spirit had followed him up the trail. She had faced his ghosts, healed his wounds, and brought life back to his cold hearth. He had thought he was rescuing her, but in the end she had rescued him. Here, on the edge of the world, in the shelter of the great silent peaks, Tyne and May had found their own small patch of redemption. Their life together was just beginning. A quiet melody of hope played against the vast, enduring silence of the mountains.